the Holy Gospel as it is recorded in Matthew. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain to be alone with them. And before their eyes, Jesus transfigured. His face became as dazzling as the sun, and his clothes as radiant as light. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said, "Rabbi, how good that we are here. With your permission, I will erect 3 shelters here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter was still speaking when suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and out of the cloud came a voice which said, "This is my own, my beloved, on whom my favor rests. Listen to him." When they heard this, the disciples fell forward on the ground, overcome with fear. And Jesus came toward them and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." When they looked up, they did not see anyone but Jesus. As they were coming down the mountainside, Jesus commanded them, "Do not tell anyone about this until the chosen one has risen from the dead." The gospel of Christ. Please be seated. So one of the best things about a good story is the way a good story lends itself to all sorts of interpretations. This story is quite thin. By that I mean that there are not very many details. This story is also quite thin in another way. You see, this story reveals a thin place. A thin place is a place where the veil between the everyday mundane things of life and the sacred holiness that is the source of all life, that veil is stretched so thin that we can see the one who is beyond the beyond and beyond that also. It is the thinness of this little story that allows it to reveal so very much about the nature of our reality. The disciples, Peter, James, and John, are taken up a high mountain by Jesus. Now, we already know that in the Hebrew scriptures, high mountains are the place to go if you want to experience the one who is the mystery that we call God. There are all sorts of interpretations about what transpired on that mountaintop. This is, after all, Transfiguration Sunday, and so many of the interpretations that we are familiar with about this story focus on the transfiguration of Jesus. I'd like to suggest another interpretation of this story. When we look closely, it is possible to see that Jesus is not the only one who is transfigured in this story. I'm pretty sure that Peter, James, and John are also transfigured. If we let ourselves wander into the story, perhaps we too can be transfigured. Now, most of us are a lot like Peter, James, and John. I mean, there's nothing remarkable about these particular followers of Jesus. They're quite typical. They bumble and stumble along, much like we do in this life. They're searching for someone, anyone, to save them. Like most of us, what they really need to be saved from is their fear. Fear is something that each one of us contends with on a daily basis. We are obsessed by our fear. So much so that it should come as no surprise to us that the phrase, "do not be afraid," appears 366 times in the Bible. As they say in Ireland, 366 times. That's one for every day of the year and one for no reason at all. Do not be afraid. In both the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian Testament, we hear first the voice of God, and then Jesus say over and over again, do not be afraid. In this little story, Peter, James, and John are overcome with fear, so much so that they fall to the ground. And Jesus comes to them, touches them, and says, "Get up, do not be afraid." Now there's a story from India that is told by the great Irish storyteller John O'Donoghue, and I love this story. It sheds light upon the darkness of our fear. And people have been telling this story for several thousand years. It's about a man who is condemned to spend a night in a cell with a poisonous snake. Now, as fears go, my fear of snake is pretty irrational. I don't know about you, but there is enmity amongst us when it comes to snakes. Anyway, this man was warned that if he made the slightest movement, the snake would be on top of him and he would die. So the man stood in the corner of the cell, directly opposite where the snake was, and he was petrified. He barely dared to breathe for fear of alerting the snake to his presence. The man stood stiffly in the corner. He was actually petrified all night long. And the next morning, as the first rays of light began to come into the cell, the man was scarcely able to make out the shape of the snake, and he said to himself, "I'm so lucky to have survived this long. I'm so lucky that I haven't moved, that I haven't alerted the snake to my presence." But as the sun rose higher, when the full force of the light came into the cell, the man could finally see that the focus of his fear was not a snake at all. It was nothing more than an old rope. In so many of the rooms of our minds, there are harmless old ropes thrown into corners. When our fear begins to work on us, we convert those old ropes into monsters. Monsters who hold us prisoner in the bleakest and most impoverished rooms of our minds. Outside of these rooms, there are glories waiting for us, but we remain transfixed and sometimes even paralyzed by our fear. Now, as a small child, I was afraid of the dark, and as I grew, I learned to reason away my fear of the dark. But given the right set of circumstances, darkness still has the ability to inspire fear in me. Sometimes I can convince myself that the deadly snakes, the ones that lurk underneath our bed, sometimes I can convince myself that those snakes lurking under there, that they're nothing more than old ropes. But there are those dark nights when even nothing more than an old rope can keep me awake, counting my fear instead of sheep. There are dark nights of the soul when I would long for any sort of talisman, even a golden calf, to save me. For who amongst us doesn't long for a divine superhero who can shed light upon all our fear and chase away all the deadly snakes and all those old ropes that threaten to keep us paralyzed? I suspect that this little transfiguration story reveals more than just the transfiguration of Jesus. I suspect that in Jesus, his followers saw an image of the divine which transfigured their images of the nature of God. And in that light, they too were transfigured. Peter, James, and John fell to the ground, overcome with fear, and Jesus came toward them and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." And somewhere inside of them, they found the strength of the one who lives and breathes in, with, through, and beyond them. And when they looked up, they did not see anyone but Jesus. Jesus, the one in whom they had seen the image of the divine. In Jesus, they saw the reality of the mystery revealed. Despite their fear, they were able to get up and follow Jesus down the mountainside into the valley, which harbored the same old ropes which they had always feared. Yet somehow, Peter, James, and John were transfigured, no longer cowering on the ground, no longer paralyzed by their fear. Inspired by the light, they were encouraged, quite literally, filled with the courage to follow Jesus all the way to Jerusalem, right into the snake pit of all their fear. Do not be afraid. Over and over again, 366 times, one for every day of the year, and once for no reason at all. Do not be afraid. Jesus is no superhero, and yet we want to make him into that golden calf. Jesus is no superhero, no magic savior who can turn snakes into old ropes. That's not who Jesus is. But in Jesus, we catch a glimpse of the light, a light which reveals the one in whom we live and move and have our being. In the light, we too are transfigured, set free from the paralysis of fear, so that we can move beyond the various corners in which we are cowering. There are no deadly snakes waiting to pounce, just old ropes, the same old ropes that have kept us in our respective corners. It is long past time for us to let the light transfigure us. Do not be afraid, for it is fear which destroys life. May the light of Christ shine forth in, with, through, and beyond us, so that each of us might be transfigured into the fullness of all that we are created to be. Get up. Do not be afraid. Follow Jesus beyond the beyond, and beyond that also, into the one who is the love we call God. Amen.